As I noted in the first chapter of Informing with the Case Method, there are a lot of concerns with the case method. And in this chapter, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some of those concerns more closely, and then I will make the argument as to when and where the case method is appropriate and why we should use it in those contexts. So what I'm going to do is cover the following. First, I'm going to talk about some arguments against the case method to sort of set the stage to identifying when the case method is most appropriate. Then I am going to look at the notion of complexity, a topic I talked about a lot in my chapter summaries of Informing Business, my other book, and try to consider the type of context where the case method might be appropriate. Finally, I am going to talk a little bit about diffusion and how the case method can play an important role in moving knowledge between practice and academia. So Stephen Shugan at the University of Florida presented 7 specific arguments against using the case method. And what I'm going to do is present each of those 7 arguments and my response to them. The first argument he made is that the Socratic case method is extraordinarily effective for teaching many skills, for example, applying written law. However, it is ancient and inferior to the scientific method. Well, there are some certain assumptions that he makes here. One, he assumes the case method and the Socratic method are synonymous, but they really aren't. The case method as applied in a law school might be, but as applied in a business school, the case method is much more peer-to-peer. The second thing that he asserts is that the scientific method is superior in business research. And I'm not necessarily convinced there's any evidence for this. If you take a look at all this business research that has been produced with the scientific method, relatively little of it applies to many situations, especially when you get into the organizational realm. So while he's certainly welcome to his opinion, this nonetheless relies on some assumptions that are questionable and an assertion which would require a lot more evidence. So let's move on to the next one, which is the case method weakens the link between research and classroom, removing critical incentives for relevant research. So what are some of the assumptions that he makes here? Well, first off, he assumes that developing a discussion case is not a form of research. I would argue that this would need considerable justification for this assumption because in my experience, the process of going out and writing a discussion case is very much a research process. He also asserts that if we use cases in the classroom, it will reduce our interest in performing other types of research. And I'm just not sure where this assertion comes from. In fact, the very notion of relevance seems to me to be highlighted by the use of case studies. As we move on to his third arguments, he says surrendering teaching to those with little knowledge of the vast marketing literature cuts the quality of marketing education. Well, here, once again, I guess it's partially a matter of taste. The assumption he makes is that facilitating a case study requires minimal knowledge of the underlying business domain. Well, you can certainly facilitate a case without a lot of knowledge of the underlying literature, but on the other hand, to facilitate a case effectively, you need quite a bit of knowledge of the business domain. So it's really a question of whether the literature is important or knowledge of the business domain and what we want to teach our students. And his assertion is that knowledge of the business literature is a critical prerequisite to quality education. Here, once again, you'd be very, very hard-pressed to justify that assertion. Fourth, the case method can teach false confidence. This assumes that participating in a typical case study will make the student more confident / arrogant, and there really isn't a lot of evidence for that. And it asserts that confidence is something that we can teach frankly, I would love to be able to teach my students confidence, but it's very hard to teach. The evidence that's usually used for an assumption that case discussion makes people more confident/arrogant is the fact that they use cases at Harvard. But my assessment is that most of us who went to Harvard went in pretty arrogant, and I'm not sure that participating in Harvard made us that much more arrogant. In fact, what I find in my own classes is that when people come into a case, they tend to believe that there is a right answer, and after the discussion, they discover there are a lot of things about the problem that they did not think about. And I don't think it makes them more confident at all. I think it makes them more measured in their judgment. His fifth is we can lose our best students. Better students who have already acquired analytical thinking skills and confidence might seek more scientific content and technical training. Well, this assumes that analytical skills and confidence is a process with a distinct end, and that once people feel that they have learned all this confidence from the case method, they're going to move on to analytical skills, as opposed to this being a process that occurs over an entire lifetime. And it asserts that students with analytical thinking skills of the type acquired in the case method will want to move on to scientific and technical skills. Here, that may be true in some circumstances, but often it's the other way. Once they have their scientific technical skills, they actually want to acquire the analytical skills and confidence that result from using case discussions. The sixth argument is some great research might never reach the classroom because translating it into case method format is too challenging. This assumes that research that's so complicated that it cannot be presented in a case form is nevertheless great research, and asserts that complicated research cannot be incorporated into a discussion case, which is, again, a somewhat questionable assumption or assertion. Finally, it asserts that the case method rarely exposes students to the latest tools for making better decisions. This one is a true mystery to me because my own experience is that I can write a case in a very short amount of time, and if I happen to be dealing with a manager who's using cutting-edge tools, then I will have that case out in 3 weeks. Whereas if I did the same thing as a journal article, especially in a top-tier journal, it would probably take 3 years. It also assumes that the research literature is the best source of tools for making better decisions. I'd need a lot of proof before I'd accept that case studies do not introduce students to cutting-edge tools, and that ideas emerge in the research literature before they appear in case studies or before they are used in practice, and there's, as far as I can tell, no evidence of that. Henry Mintzberg, a professor at McGill and a well-known management researcher, had his own critique of the case method. What he stated is the following: managers have to sense things, they have to weave their way through complex phenomena, they have to dig out information, they have to probe deeply on the ground, not from the top of some mythical pyramid, the organizational hierarchy. The big picture is not there for the seeing, certainly not in any 20-page document. It has to be constructed slowly, carefully, through years of intimate experience. Now, on the one hand, I would agree with him that a case study is not a full representation of a complex business problem. You simply cannot get all the details of the context and all the details of experience in a 20 or 30 page document, and there you're pressing the limit of what a student's willing to read. But on the other hand, it's really an argument against all business education. And by the way, Mintzberg pretty much makes that argument. He believes that we shouldn't be educating people in business until they're highly experienced executives. And he says that rather forthrightly in his book about MBAs. And my argument would be that that's well and good, and appreciate the fact that he wants to teach only highly experienced executives, but the fact is that other folks actually feel like they're learning stuff from a business education, and I don't think we can deny them just because case studies are imperfect. Because really, whether or not a case is imperfect as a pedagogical tool is not as critical as how it compares to the other tools that are available. So having discussed a lot of the criticisms of the case method, what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about domains where the drawbacks of cases are far outweighed by their strengths. And in my book, Informing Business, and in my summary slides, I talk a lot about complexity. So I briefly want to talk a little bit about that. And I'll limit myself to decomposable versus rugged landscapes. And the idea is that when you're trying to make a decision or when you're looking at an outcome, in a decomposable landscape, we basically can look at the contributions of all the different elements of your decision to get an overall fitness. And obviously, the higher the fitness, the better. In each case, these things contribute separately. So, for example, if you were trying to evaluate the fitness of a school, you'd give a certain number of points to having an athletic program, a certain number of points to its academics, a certain number of points to its social, and so forth, and you'd add them up and you get a score. That's the way college rankings work. Now, another possibility is interactions. And in interactions, you really can't identify the contribution to fitness of individual variables, and even a small change in one variable can lead to a big change in overall fitness, either up or down. And the example that I like to use for interacting fitness is that of a recipe. So let's think about this example and compare a test with this recipe I'm talking about. Now, in a test, you have a whole series of questions, and each question adds to your overall score independently, which means if the answer to question 17 is C, you'll always do better by answering C to question 17, regardless of what you answer for the other questions. Now, when we talk about recipes, which are like a rugged environment, if you look at a cookbook, for example, you can think of it as a collection of local peaks, each recipe representing the author's conception of what the best combination of that particular set of ingredients are. But you can't do a lot of reasoning across recipes. So a question such as, is garlic a good ingredient, really doesn't make sense in the context of a cookbook, because it's obviously going to be a good ingredient in some contexts, say recipes with lamb, or a lot of them, but it might be a terrible ingredient in other contexts, such as angel food cake desserts. And so it's really the combination that determines the overall fitness, not the sum of the individual attributes. Now, conceptually, rugged and decomposable landscapes can be viewed sort of the way we would normally view landscapes. And if we imagine fitness to be the altitude of the landscape, a decomposable landscape produces a very, very different shape from a rugged landscape. In the case of a decomposable landscape, what happens is, because every individual element adds to fitness a specific amount, there is a single peak where you've got every element at its best value. So you can imagine it as being kind of like a pyramid. And this type of landscape is relatively easy to search, because you just test each attribute individually, find the best value for each attribute, and then move on to the next attribute. By the time all the attributes have their best value, you're up here at the peak. Now, in a rugged fitness landscape, we have a very, very different shape, because individual changes to attributes can produce sharp drop-offs, and an attribute that's good in one context, say garlic in lamb may not be good in another context, say garlic in angel food cake. So this leads to a landscape with lots and lots of local peaks and sharp drop-offs. And each peak, in a sense, needs to be explored separately. So if you think of this in the case context, you really only need one case study in this particular decomposable case because all of the attributes are set to the best value. But here you need to explore lots of different combinations, and depending upon the attributes of, say, the manager, there may be some combinations that will work for her that will not work for a different manager in a different context. So I think the interesting question to be raised here is, where do business problems sit on this continuum of low complexity decomposability and high complexity ruggedness? Now, if you believe that business problems are low complexity, then I would argue the arguments made by Shugan hold a lot of water. Because basically in this low complexity domain, we can expect rules to be developed that are widely applicable across business problems. It's probably much better than looking at individual problems. If, on the other hand, you believe we're in a high complexity environment, for example, the fine arts, if you think of a painting as a collection of pixels, nobody expects that there's an optimal color for some pixel in the middle. It, of course, depends upon what you're painting. But if you believe that business is more towards the art, then there's considerable value for studying the individual peaks, which is to say the case studies of where managers think they have positioned themselves, as opposed to worrying too much about general problems. So I suppose that the relevance of the case method is going to depend to a large extent as to whether you believe that the landscape of business is relatively orderly and decomposable, or whether you believe it's highly rugged. And so if we think about business, the real question becomes, does business exist on a rugged landscape? Because whether or not the case method is going to be appropriate will depend heavily on that. So what's some of the evidence? Well, there are a lot of different business approaches that succeed, some very different approaches. For example, even within industry, you may have one competitor successfully competing on price with another competitor successfully differentiating themselves. Michael Porter's work on strategy basically argues there are a number of different generic strategies that you might apply. This is certainly something you'd expect in a rugged landscape. You would not expect that in a landscape governed by a clear set of principles. Another thing is what works depends upon context. And we certainly see that. For example, when an Apple executive was hired by J.C. Penney, the Apple executive who had designed Apple stores decided that he would apply the same rules to J.C. Penney. So he got rid of sales. He basically standardized prices. Well, it turned out that people won't buy from J.C. Penney unless they're on sale, and as a consequence, essentially, he almost drove the company bankrupt. So something that succeeded in one context did not succeed in another. Another example is research that doesn't replicate. In a world like physics, we expect, indeed we demand our research to replicate, whereas the history of business research has been very little replication, and in fact our top journals won't even accept papers that attempt to replicate research, perhaps precisely because of the reason it doesn't replicate very well. Another thing we might look for is where little changes can have a big impact. When I talk about informing business, I give the history of tablets and look at all the different variations of tablets that did not succeed before Apple's iPad suddenly became one of the most successful consumer products in history. Resistance to change is common in a rugged landscape. Why? Because ultimately everybody tries to migrate to a peak. And once you think you've reached that peak, the only way to move is to go down in fitness until you climb up to another peak. And as a consequence, we would expect people to hang on to their existing peaks, perhaps even irrationally, in the face of uncertainty. Finally, we have turbulence is common in complex landscapes. Orderly landscapes tend to be stable. Complex landscapes tend to experience rapid shifts, in part, I suppose, because once a peak stops working, you tend to get a mass migration of people from one peak to another. So instead of getting gradual, continuous change, you tend to get stability interspersed by rapid change as the landscape reorients itself. My argument is that if we look at these things, business looks like it exists on a very rugged landscape indeed, which should give us more confidence in arguing for the use of the case method in our research and teaching. Personally, I find the rugged landscape to be a very powerful metaphor for thinking about business situations. And in a rugged landscape, what you need to do is you need to think about research in different ways and teaching in different ways. Instead of looking for rules, what you want to do is focus on helping the researcher or the student think about how you distinguish peaks from non-peaks, because that can be kind of a general process, whereas the specifics of the peak are going to be specific to where you are in the landscape. Another thing that we need to do in this context is use all the evidence available to understand what impacts fitness. One of the challenges of fitness as a concept is that you really don't know fitness until a long time after an event. If we look at it from a biological perspective, if I just told you what an organism looked like, you'd have a very tough time predicting whether or not it would succeed or fail. Similarly, with a decision, it often takes years before we know whether a decision is successful or not. So, in a very real sense, part of what we need to do is we need to gather evidence from multiple sources to make our best possible estimate of fitness. Another thing we need to do is study techniques for investigating local fitness, try to figure out what is and is not important in a particular context. And we need to be suspicious of attractive theories. If a theory is very simple, then chances are it's not going to work everywhere. And you ought to be very suspicious of business books that suggest that they have got a formula for success, because in a rugged, complex landscape, there is not going to be a single formula. There will be lots of different formulas. That doesn't mean you have to ignore these books, but what you need to do is you need to look at their recommendations and try to assess how relevant they're likely to be to the particular situation that you're in. Final thing is you want to pay very particular attention to outliers. In traditional research, one of the things we do to get our statistics to work properly is we tend to throw out observations that clearly don't fit the pattern. And if we don't have too many of them, we just say they're outliers and we don't worry about them. In a rugged landscape, outliers often represent a huge amount of fitness. If we look at all the small businesses, for example, you could argue that Microsoft is an outlier, having grown from a tiny business to dominating the world's software in a very short period of time. So if you were studying software companies, it might make sense to throw out Microsoft if you're looking for general rules. On the other hand, if what you care about is the total distribution of fitness across the environment, a tremendous percentage of the value of software in the world was held by Microsoft. So if you're looking at it in value terms, you really need to pay attention to outliers, because outliers will often give you significant insights into what is coming next or where the world is going. And this is the type of thing that we can do very effectively with the use of case studies. We've talked mainly in this chapter about the importance of case studies as they map to complex landscapes and why cases might be better as a research and teaching tool. But there's an entirely different element of case studies, and that is the fact that case studies are presented in the form of a story, and for perhaps biological reasons, the story is one of the most resonant forms of communication. So in addition to providing a good mapping to the landscape, cases, by telling us a story, ultimately increase the likelihood that we will be able to retrieve the lessons that we've learned from studying the case at a later time. And it also means that it may be more easy to communicate those lessons to other individuals. And as I look back on my MBA and my introduction to MIS, the vast majority of what I remember is not what theory they introduced to me, but rather the stories of some important organizations such as American Airlines and Digital Equipment Corporation, American Hospital Supply. These case studies illustrated the lessons in a way that the theory simply could not capture. So to conclude, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the fit between the case method and rugged landscapes. In other words, when we're studying problems that exist on rugged landscapes. And there are really a number of sources of fit. First off, we talked about how on rugged landscapes you want to distinguish peaks from non-peaks. Well, with the case method, the discussion always focuses on better versus worse when we look at decisions. It's not looking for the right answer, but basically we're trying to figure out the elements of a particular decision that make it better or worse. And this is very much along the lines of distinguishing peaks from non-peaks. Using multiple sources of evidence, well, that's core to the case method, whether it's in the form of a teaching case with exhibits or whether it's case research, which considers evidence from many sources. We suggested you want to study mechanisms for impacting fitness local to the problem that we're looking at. And when we look at the case method, a lot of them are very, very specifically focused on a decision and a problem rather than on a theory. You want to be very suspicious of attractive theories, and a good case study always deals with difficult problems and actually tends to encourage you to construct your own theory or your own conceptual scheme is the term that I use that's appropriate to the particular situation. Finally, the case method encourages you to pay attention to outliers, which are, of course, are very important on a rugged landscape. And because the case method is an exploratory approach, it allows you to look for outliers and write cases about them. So what I have attempted to show here is if you believe the world is a particular way, and if you're concerned about the resonance of the research and teaching that you use, then there is a really good argument to be made for using case studies.